And so then we're living in Idaho, in Pocatello, and my mother got a job for Merrill & Merrill. It's a law firm. My mother was an incredible secretary, stenographer. Boy, could she type. Unbelievable typist. And this was a firm that had the predecessor, the Xerox. You might be old enough to remember, when you got a birth certificate, it was white letters on black background before the Xerox machines came out. And it was a big deal to get a copy. Remember this machine, it was this big machine about the size of a car. Not really, but when I was in my little kid's eyes, the thing would make all this noise, and this little thing would come out and was still wet, and it was the birth certificate, black background, white print on it. Well, my dad went to prison in 1944, and so he quote-unquote paid the price for the children born before 1944. But then they came to arrest him in 1955, and we had to go into hiding. So none of the children between 1944 and 1955 had a birth certificate except for my mother's 3 sons. My mother had a first son in 1940, and my brother Rex, he's number 24 out of 48. So think about all my dad's kids. The first half were born before her son, and so it came time to get us in school, and you had to have a birth certificate to get into school. Well, 11 of the kids did not have birth certificates. 11 of them. And so my mother managed on her lunch hours. My mother managed on her lunch hour to make forgeries, to make false copies. She took our birth certificates, made copies of them, did cut and paste. Then she created birth certificates for all of my other 11 brothers and sisters who did not have birth certificates, so they could all get in different schools. They all had different. They went to school with different last names. So my 2 brothers and I were the only ones who were named Allred out of the siblings my age.
And again, you didn't refer to your dad as
no, but
Rulon.
No, we didn't. But even though legally I was legally his son, but they called, when we went into hiding in 1955 to 1958, we all called him Uncle Jim. Uncle Jim, yeah. All called him Uncle Jim. That created a problem though, and then later that my Aunt Ruth became pregnant, and the kids talked about, and my mom's pregnant. Yeah, Uncle Jim came to see her. That was the only thing about it. My dad didn't think it was very funny.
They knew he was their dad, right?
Oh, absolutely. They called him
Uncle Jim as a cover.
No, yeah, in private.
So what does it do? What does it do to sort of have this systematic lying?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
What does that do?
You are such a good interviewer. You know right where I'm going. And so here's this dichotomy. Lance talks about it in his TED Talk. You're taught not to lie, but you can't tell people who your dad is. So you have to lie to protect daddy. And so then there are good lies and bad lies. And then pretty soon, who determines what the bad lies are and what the good lies are? People like my mother were never confused. My father's wives were never confused. But pretty soon, a whole bunch of people started, including me. We all became confused. When can we lie and when can we not? And it creates a real problem. But at the same time, and Lance talked about this as well, you're in hiding. Think about it. Ever think about what going in hiding does to your sense of belief as to who you are relevant to the rest of the world? You're special. And my heroes were Elijah, the prophet, who had to hide. Elisha, who was hidden away. And then a story we read about the Jews. And boy, we could relate to that. My dad, unlike most fundamentalists, hate Jews. My dad loved the Jews. He totally supported them, and great fan of the founding of Israel. But that, again, led to the feeling that we were special, because we were persecuted. Jesus says, blessed are you, and they spitefully use you and persecute you and boy, that was us. That fit us to a T.
So do you think that leads to a culture of deceit?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So that feeds it.
Right, but then it comes to the point, section, the articles, the Section 51, for example, says, to obey the law of the land, but Section 98 says, I will support you in obeying the laws of the land that are constitutional. So every polygamist is a constitutional attorney. They know it to a T.
It's a way to justify
absolutely.
Breaking the law.
Anything they want some of my own brothers are like this. They can justify anything. Every single law there is unconstitutional.
There really is no law.
They have no respect for the law.
Yeah.
My mother, however, was married to Aunt Ethel, and Aunt Mabel's kids, and Aunt Etheleen's kids were raised like I was. Great respect for the law, but a lot of my siblings were not.
So tell me so your dad's building up his own sort of branch during this time.
Right.
Okay, so were you guys meeting in chapels? Did you meet on the frontier? What was his church like relative to what an LDS church member would experience?
This guy's really good, you know that? That's right where I was going next. You are so good. I can't believe it. Okay.
Is this a backhanded compliment?
No, it really is. It's on it. It's pretty good. So picture this. I'll fast forward. I was in my very first day of first grade, September 5th, 1957. I remember it because this is the very first time ever I was around other kids who were not polygamous kids. First time ever. My mother drops me out of school, and I walk in this room. Most of them were Mormon kids, I realized later. And they're talking back and forth, and finally the one kid looked at me and realized, you don't go to church with us. No. Well, where do you go to church? And I said, in my house. I go to church in my house. Of course, right away. That was not a pleasant experience.
This is Idaho, right?
Idaho, Pocatello, Idaho.
Okay.
And so church was wherever our family was. And so my dad had very few followers at this time. There was a total, I think at this time, of about 15 men who followed my father and thought he held all the keys. Because the vast majority of them went with the Colorado City group. A lot of that had to do with the fact that they controlled all the money. It's amazing how having all the money gives you validity.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. Follow the money. And my dad had no money, and then my dad went into hiding for 4 years. He was literally in hiding, and the FBI was looking for him, and the police were looking for him. He was constantly having to move around, and there were twice when our family had to move in the middle of the night because the police were getting ready to arrest us. Not my mother. My mother had the luxury of being quote unquote the legal wife, but almost all the others had to move around from time to time because they were getting under investigation. And so constantly we would get together in our rooms. And in my entire childhood, I was 5 years old the first time I met any of my cousins. I had 47 brothers and sisters. It's not like I was deprived of child contact, but the first time I met my cousins, I was 4 years old. And then a year and a half later, I went to school. I met other kids for the first time. And so my world was so very, very small. But we would have Sunday school in our room. And so always where I was, no matter where I was living, there were always three of my mothers there. And so all of the children of three mothers would get together, and we'd have these wonderful lessons. And then my older sisters would take us off back in the bedroom for the 7 and 8 year olds and the 9 to 10 year olds, and they had the church manuals. They got the LDS church manuals for Sunday school and primary, and they would use those to teach us. And I will tell you, the Allred family did a better job of communicating and teaching their kids than anybody in Mormonism. I guarantee you that. I have a funny story. Years later, at Skyline High School, I was
Skyline
High School. I went to high school here, and I was the only polygamous kid. And the Mormons were not nice to me. They were very unkind.
They knew.
Oh, absolutely. But they recruited me to be the captain of their seminary bowl team because I knew Mormonism better than anybody in that school.
Nice. So did you use the hymn book, the LDS hymn book?
Oh yeah.
You sang the hymns?
Oh yeah.
Were there any hymns that you didn't sing because they weren't?
No, but there were a few hymns that had been made politically correct that we had to go back to in our pen and scratch them out.
Which ones? Do you remember?
For example, yeah. Praise to the Man, Joseph Smith. Praise to the Man, and community, so forth and so on. It says,
long will his blood, which was shed
by assassins. Second verse. Now it's been changed.
Stain, Illinois.
Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins. Now it says, plead unto heaven.
Right, but it was Stain,
Illinois.
So you went back to the Illinois.
Oh, absolutely.
You went back to
crossed that out.
Illinois. Yeah. Okay.
And then "O Ye Mountains High" by the Clear Judge Charles Penrose hymn. "O Ye Mountains High," and what is the verse? I can't remember. I have to have the hymn book, but it says one verse. It said the original verse was every knee shall bow
and tongue confess.
And that's been changed out. That's been made politically correct. But the other thing, but my dad knew the scriptures. He knew them backwards and forwards. Of course, he could. It's amazing though, because I realized later. And I'm embarrassed with this. When my dad would read the scriptures, and what really came to me, fast forward a long time later, it was actually after I joined the LDS Church, and our mentors were Jeff and Heidi Swinton, wonderful people. I don't know, she's the one who wrote the biography of President Monson. She also wrote the Trail of the Joseph Smith biography, one that was made a documentary. But they were our mentors. They lived on our block. But I kept having this problem with this thing about ordinances and how important it was. And I read it to Jeff, and I kept reading it to him. And it says that those who do not have the ordinance, without these, they cannot stand in the presence of God. And finally, Jeff handed it 3 times. Vance, read it again. Finally, I realized it didn't say these. It said it. I'd read that scripture hundreds and hundreds of times. I'd taught from that scripture. I'd quoted that scripture. And I always had these, thinking it referred to, there was a pronoun modifying ordinances, but it says it. It's always said it, emphasizing, modifying the priesthood. My point being, there were dozens and dozens of scriptures that my dad would quote just a little bit off to support his position. And even after I got my own scriptures and I started reading them, and after I'd read them all, and I became quite good with the scriptures, even after I joined the LDS Church, became a Main Street Mormon, I still kept quoting and reading them the way my dad had
You were primed.
Exactly.
To see them a certain way.
And finally, I went.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And but I came to realize that he actually, that's what he believed. And so he needed to turn things so that they fit his perception.
Okay.
And I realized that we all do that. But the fact that my father, the prophet of God, could do it, that was really jarring to me when I realized that my dad always had a way of explaining it. So
give us just a really brief sort of overview of like how he builds an empire or builds a large group.
It was phenomenal. I was 7 years old when we moved back to Salt Lake City. And he got his entire group together, and I kid you not, they fit in an area smaller than this apartment. Adults, children, everybody.
And the approximate year?
This would have been 1957 through 1963. 1963, we started to get new converts, people that had left the church. There was oftentimes young couples. Another thing also is that my dad's children were growing up, and my dad encouraged the older siblings to join the church. But then they joined the
LDS church.
Yeah, the LDS mainline church. But then they went away, and they didn't come back. So then my dad started saying, no more of that. And so he encouraged the rest of us to stay in the group. He didn't want us to go to the church. And those that left and went to the church, he kept trying to get to come back. And some of them he succeeded in bringing back. I have some real tragic stories from that. But then these people started coming around and investigating our group. And I realize now, as an adult, looking back on all of them, they all fit into one of those three categories. I could tell you the story of every single one of them. And if the wife was in favor of it, she usually had brought her husband. It wasn't the wife who was being brought by the husband. It was the wife who was bringing the husband. Because she had met somebody like my mother. And my father's wives, I'm not saying they converted him, but they sent such a good example. The women would say, man, I've never seen anything like this. And they would want the same thing.
There are benefits, right? Other people to watch your kids. Yeah. Like if you're not maybe wanting to be with the man all the time, you get a little break. Right? Like, and what are other benefits from a woman's point of view? Well, there's several things. First of all, women are allowed to go out, and the women certainly had far more independence. They can work.
They can get a career. They can buy their own car. They can do all these kinds of things. They can, I remember it got to the point, my dad came over to see my mother every fifth day. I could look at a calendar for the next 2 years and tell you which day my dad would be in my house. He had this schedule. And that's what my mother wanted. And that's what that novel wanted. And, but it got to the point my mother would often say, the morning my dad was there, Rulon, I love having you here, but you always put me behind in my schedule. You know what I'm saying? And because then they started to have their own lives beside him. But Aunt Ethelene, when Dad came, everything stopped. Everything stopped when Dad showed up. She didn't care what was going on. It might make sense. Well, my mother stayed on the schedule. But the respect those women had for each other, and my dad's sisters, some of my dad's sisters were phenomenal. I mean, same caliber of women. My Aunt Beth, for example, was married to Lima Jessup. I loved and honored, I still do Lima Jessup. Very honorable man, very sweet man, but not well educated. Beth was not, quote unquote, well educated. She only had a high school diploma, but she could take anybody on with a master's or PhD in history or literature or anything. Brilliant, brilliant woman. And she raised her kids to be that way. And so had these really remarkable women. And there were not a few. And like,
not a bunch of dummies.
No, not the women who converted to polygamy that I knew were either the oppressed, meek lambs, or these powerful, vibrant women, not dominant women. I have so much regard for them, all of them. I hold them all in high esteem, and I've held conversations with some of them that just like blow my doors off. You know, they just wow. You know, we're talking about something. We're talking history. You know, they're talking about the this empire, that empire, and wow. But they are the minority, very small. I would say less than 5%.
So your dad starts building things up late 50s?
Right, the late 50s, still again, it's still very small, and still most of them are relatives. And so what began to happen is that the children would grow up, and they'd marry, and then the in-laws would start to come in, and they start to investigate. And that's how most of it started. Because my dad's brothers, my Uncle Owen and my Uncle Marvin. Uncle Marvin married 3 of Lyman Jessup's daughters. These are my Aunt Ethel's sisters. And they did a wonderful job, beautiful job. Aunt Ethel's and Uncle Owen's family did a beautiful job. So there were these, and the Jensens did it. They did a beautiful job. And so they started gathering people, other members of the LDS wards close by coming in.
All in Salt Lake?
All in Salt Lake. There were a few,
Brethren have to be freaking out about this.
They were really freaking out. But at places, but my family lived out in Elko, Nevada, and when people saw, my Aunt Mabel and Aunt Melba always lived next door to each other, always. And it took people a while to realize they were both married to the same man because they're identical twins. And but then people started, wherever my dad went, he got followers. Wherever my mother's lived, he got followers. But then in the early 60s, there was a new group of men who came in, and I guess I can use names. The man who really did it was a man named John Ray. He was a convert to the LDS Church, very charismatic, very well educated. Do you need to download something? And he personally brought in about half of the converts to my father's group. He had 12 women who married him, including my mother-in-law. And then there was another group down in Cedar City. I had a lot of respect for them growing up because they were well educated men. These guys all had college degrees. Because here again, in my dad's group, he had a college degree, but none of his followers did growing up. He's the only one with a college degree. My uncles hadn't gone to college. But he started getting these new converts that had college degrees. And so there were these 5 men in Cedar City joining my father's group. This was in about 1964, 5, 6. And they came up, and by this time, my Uncle Owen had he had a garage. It was like a 4-car garage inside of his house, and we all fit into that for years. And then my dad had bought the ranch in Montana, which became Pinesdale, Montana. And it's in the Bitterroot Valley. We were just there a couple of days ago. It is magical. Picture this. He bought it in sections. They were not contiguous when he started buying them, but eventually it became 1,020 acres on the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest, and the nearest neighbor to the west is 110 miles away. What a perfect place for a private city, for a special place to go. And as time went by, not quite, but almost 50% of my dad's followers lived there.
In Montana?
In Montana.
Okay.
And all of them became construction workers, and they're honorable, hardworking men. And many of them are my cousins or nephews, they're almost all Jessups, related to Jessup somehow or other.
Well, help me understand. I am running together Jeffs and Jessups.
Right, completely different families.
How do we think of one? I mean, obviously you don't love the Jeffs. It's Warren Jeffs. It's lots of bad stuff. How do we think of the Jessups, just to remember?
The Jessups, I have tremendous respect for the Jessups. I really do.
Were they part of the Allred?
Oh, yeah. Well, about half of them. See, they're the backbone of both groups.
Okay.
They're the backbone of the Jess group and the backbone of the AUB.
Got it. Okay.
And some of them have been in leadership positions. None of them has become the man.
Got it.
But they're high in leaderships, and gosh, 6 of my sisters married Jessups.
Is there a most famous Jessup?
Lyman Jessup he's the patriarch. He was my father's brother-in-law. He was my father's cellmate when they went to prison together.
Okay, that's the Jessup. Okay.
And so because he married my dad's sister, and then my dad married his daughter. My Uncle Marvin married 3 of his daughters.
Okay, got it. So your dad starts expanding, gets into construction, buys up land in Montana. Mm-hmm. Is there a center for the Allred Group in Utah? For some reason, I'm thinking
it's always been here. It's always been here in the Salt Lake Valley.
Salt Lake Valley.
Wherever Dad lived, that's where it was.
And do you have a sense for at the height of the Allred Group, how many people were followers? Or
I have no idea. I left in '94. I don't know. '93. I don't know.
Hundreds, thousands,
thousands.
Tens of thousands.
When my dad died, we figured we had at least. There were 7,000 people in the group. He had 7,000 followers for real. I know he had at least 1,200 tithe payers. Okay.
And talk to us about important things that led up to your dad's death. Unless we can move to that. So.
Talking about my dad's death it's a long story, but I'll make it very, very compressed. My dad controlled a lot of money. And when you have, thousands of people paying tithing to you, that becomes a lot of money. But not only that, they would sign over the property to you. You build a house and you give your land to the priesthood. I built 3 houses on property that I did not control, that eventually the AUB got it all. And because that's the concept of living a lot of consecration. And but so you had the Church of the Firstborn. There were the brothers, and I only knew one of them very well, Rulon. He was married 3 of my cousins. He's a very fine man. I have nothing but good to say about Rulon, but very interesting. Different people had different views as to from where the authority came. Most fundamentalists believe that they got it from this Lawrence C. Woolley. The Church of the Firstborn, the LeBarons, they have a different line completely. They claim to got it from a guy named Benjamin F. Johnson, and it comes down through a totally different line. And part of their line is a concept that goes through patriarchy or through the brothers. Whereas the Mormon Church doesn't believe anything like that. Yes, there are sometimes people who are related, but it doesn't go through the families. But the Baron group does, and it's ironic because it was my father. When my father was, I didn't tell you about. My father went to Mexico in 1947. My dad went to Mexico for a while, took all of his wives down there, and it was then that he met a lot of LeBarons, and he actually converted them. They became his followers at first, but within a short time they broke off and they become their own. They become their own group. And but then I first heard whispers of there was a guy named Ben LeBaron. I never saw it, but he would come to our meetings. But not in the middle of meetings, he'd have some sort of holy roller event. And I don't mean to be making fun of anybody true, but I'm not sure. He had a seizure or whatever. But he'd start rolling around on the floor, and that was my first experience with the LeBarons. But then I heard about these guys, and at one time they were the largest fundamentalist group because you've heard of the guys, the young missionaries who went to France, and they got copies of the Journal of Discourses on this. You know that story. Okay. I didn't know the story very well because it's just peripheral to me, but there were some young missionaries who were on a steamliner going over to France before they flew them over, and they got a set of the Journal of Discourses. Started reading them, and reading that there's a lot of historical dissonance between what the leaders of the church today teach and what they taught in 1850, 1860, 1870. The chief of which being the Adam God doctrine. Gives you a totally different slant on everything. And the Adam God doctrine really is what converts people to go to polygamy. It's not the plurality of wives. The women are attracted because they see how happy the women are. The men are attracted because the Adam God doctrine, this is Brigham Young's talk. He talked about it very specifically. It's volume 1, page 50 of the Journal of Discourses. He said that Adam is our father and our God and the only God with whom we have to deal. He says that Adam, or Michael, was the actual biological father of Jesus Christ. He had sexual intercourse. He doesn't use the words, but he says, how is he the father of Jesus Christ the same way I am the father of my sons, or any man would be the father of a son? That's blasphemy. You get excommunicated in the church believing that. Well, Brigham Young taught it.
Right. But what does that do with polygamy?
That's why you live polygamy, is to become a god. Because only men with more than one wife get to be a god. And only men with more than one wife.
Because who said that?
Brigham Young.
So Brigham Young, if you believe...
Volume 16, page 166.
So if you believe Brigham Young,
that
you have to be a polygamist to become a god, then you also have to believe Brigham Young when he says that Adam was God and impregnated Mary.
That's right.
Okay.
But if you read Joe the Smith, volume 3, page 389...
So it's really Brigham Young. It's not Adam God theory.
No, we'll see that. But the other thing about it, it's so ironic, and that when Brigham Young was alive, I heard this story. The church says Brigham Young didn't teach that. Well, here it is. Well, okay, he only said it once. Well, that's not true. A guy named read his book.
I don't think anybody disputes that Brigham Young taught that.
Okay, I would hope so. No any well-educated person who will claim that Brigham Young didn't teach that is going to vote for Donald Trump next week. They're going to vote for Donald Trump.
Okay.
Cool. But the thing about it, and this is what is the hardest thing for me to explain, is that it sounds like so totally out from left field. Because you're talking about this polygamy and the culture and everything else. That's the what and that's the how. The Adam God doctrine is the why. It's the why they do it. And I remember one time, my dad, I was riding in a car with my dad. The first time I heard him explain the doctrine, which I won't try to get into, that's very complex. And he explained to my aunt Elsie, he was one of my Uncle Owen's wives. This is what got him to become a fundamentalist. This is what convinced him he had to have more than one wife. Brigham Young's teachings. It's a very sophisticated doctrine. It's a very complex doctrine, which I won't try to get into.
Okay. But you're saying the LeBarons found out about this.
Right. Well, these missionaries read it. And so they got sidetracked in that. And then they came back to the United States. They began looking for somebody. They didn't find my dad. They found the LeBarons. Then they started proselyting for the LeBarons, and it became a huge group, thousands and thousands of people.
Where
in Mexico. It was centered in Mexico. Okay. It didn't last very long, however.
Like what era were the LeBarons?
It's like this when it was big. This is like the late 50s, early 60s.
Okay.
But then so then a lot of these guys that I'm telling you about in Cedar City, they were first attracted to that because of those missionaries. I don't even know their names, but they went and did a lot of proselyting for the Church of the Firstborn, the LeBaron group. But then when people got in and realized the Church of the Firstborn, they were just these psychotic people. And so a lot of them began to leave. And that's where many of my father's followers had been before they came to him. And so they deserve credit, or whatever you want to call it, for bringing them, towards fundamentalism. And
and for helping to build up your dad's organization.
Yeah. And my dad's organization flourished because a lot of it.
Because the LeBarons came over.
Yeah. And but they were arch enemies.
Church of the Firstborn.
Yeah, Church of the Firstborn. They became the Church of the Firstborn. And then, but in 1974, first time I'd ever heard of Orville LeBaron, and the fact that he would he was starting to murder people. This is happening down south of the border. It's like, we can kind of blot it out. But then in 1974, some of their followers started coming to our meetings, and they would disrupt some of our meetings. And a couple of times, I was never there, but a couple of times, guys would stand up and say, hey, well, you don't want to be here, you just need to leave. I came to testify as the true prophet. Well, no, you just need to leave. And the first time I actually saw him was 1975, May of 1975. I was at our meeting house out in Bluffdale, Utah, and suddenly saw this guy out in the parking lot passing out flyers on a car's name. He's Eddie Marston. You read about him later. He's one of the murderers and later one of the murder victims. He was passing these flyers out on our cars, and we went out to confront him. And my dad was there. My dad and 4 or 5 of my brothers and some brothers-in-law, and he called us to repentance. He called us to repentance so that we would be blood atoned. Blood atonement is a noun, but they use fundamentally it's become a verb to be blood atoned. It means that you've been murdered. God's chosen to have your life taken for your own good. We're killing you for your own good because you're doing these terrible.
He tells your dad this.
Oh yeah, and because what
was the sin in his mind?
Not giving Orville your money. That's really what it was.
Okay.
We want your money.
Well,
we want your money and your obedience and your obeisance. We want your obeisance. We want you to acknowledge that we are the ones. And so on May 10th, 1977, when I heard my dad was dead, I had no question whatsoever who was the author. I didn't know who pulled the trigger. I knew Orville LeBaron was behind it. So my dad started to talk quite a bit. I should say a lot, maybe 5 or 6 times. I remember he'd bring in a meeting. He says, something that I would not be surprised if the Lord calls me home early. And if I die, I'm sure if I'm called home, I'm sure it will be at the hands of Orville LeBaron.
So where was your dad when it happened?
It was in Pinestone, Montana. I heard him say that, but he was at his office here in Murray when he was murdered.
Here in Murray.
Yeah, the building's still there. It's a little building. It's 133 East, 4800 South. I don't know what it is now.
He's in his office, doctor's office.
He was in his office, doctor's office, and these two young women walk in, and they actually told my mother, my Aunt Melba, she was my dad's nurse. Aunt Melba was. She said, "Well, I'll be with you in just a minute." And then she went to the back, to see him. He had picture a chiropractor's office with the chiropractor type tables. He had 4 rooms like that, and most of his work was chiropractic, but he did other things too, minor surgery, things like that.
He wasn't doing deliveries at this.
No, he was, but he never in his office. He would go to women's houses
because he wasn't licensed.
But he still at the time he delivered 250 babies, about 200 to 250 babies a year.
But not in the office.
But not ever in the office.
Okay.
He always
chiropractic stuff.
Right.
Okay.
And so Aunt Melba walks back there to see my dad, and these women followed her back, and they just wanted to pull out a gun and just shot him, just like that.
2 guns
Twice.
or 1 gun?
As far as I know, 1 gun. Shot him twice.
Which woman?
Well, no one was ever later. Rena Shanoff is one who she later wrote a book. After she was acquitted, she wrote a book admitting that she had done it.
She was acquitted? Mm-hmm. Why was she acquitted?
Because the Mormons on the jury thought my dad deserved it.
What? So she was tried in Salt Lake City, and they just let her off.
Oh yeah, she was acquitted. I know for a fact one of the men, I wasn't there, but people that I highly trust and believe to be true, heard one of the jurors come out and he says, the old bastard deserved it.
So they were grateful.
Maybe not grateful, but they didn't. I have some residual feelings. Even though I left the Allred group and I joined the LDS church.
Wait, let's not get there yet.
Right. No, I'm saying even though I've done that, I still have some residual feelings that how I was treated as a child by Mormons in Utah, very unkindly, and about the fact that my father was murdered, and all the jokes being told about it, and all the unkindness going around about it, all the lack of sympathy about it, her getting acquitted, when anybody with any sense at all knew she had killed him, and the proof was irrefutable. I talked to Dick Forbes, the guy who compiled all of the evidence against her. It was a slam dunk.
So it was the LeBarons who sent these two women.
Yeah, they were actually the wives of Irva LeBaron. They were his wives.
Okay.
So apparently, he brought them up to Saul. He was here in Utah with them, and then he gave them this commission from God to go kill the false prophet.
Okay. And
that's why actually they actually went to fire rounds into his face. They didn't. They were going to shoot him in the face, but for whatever reason, they didn't get that far. They wanted to destroy the face of the false prophet.
So do you remember where you were when you heard?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Where were you?
I was in my house in Pinestone, Montana. And my wife came across. I had two wives at the time. My second wife was in labor with her. Labor would be my son. She didn't. She started having labor there in Pinestone. We drove to Salt Lake, and he was born here the next day.
Which son?
My oldest son, David. He lives in Australia today.
Okay.
But I remember that very vividly.
What was that like for you?
It was awful. Several things about it were so awful. First of all, it was when my dad was alive, I had confidence that the priesthood, quote unquote, was going in the right direction. My dad believed very strongly that Jesus was returning. His return was imminent. It sounds funny now, but I lived in Pinestone, Montana, and there was picture 1,000 acres. By this time, there were about 500 people living there, and I was the youngest male that was, living pro marriage in my father's family, and also men living on the ranch. I was the youngest one who went to all these special meetings. Whatever. My father was grooming me
to be a successor.
I don't know about to be the successor, but he definitely had expected all of his sons to become apostles. And I say that it was not something I was proud of. It was something I was burdened with. I don't know if
because of the responsibility.
Yeah.
Did he have 12 apostles?
No, it wasn't a specific number. There's no specific
Just
number.
apostles.
Yeah, they were apostles, and he didn't call them that. He was too reverent to call them apostles. They were called disciples, or members of the council. And but every time my dad, and he came out to Montana almost like clockwork, once every 3 weeks, and it was so incredible because he would come. He would arrive usually on a Thursday afternoon. The whole community would just get worked up into this frenzy, just working with. Here we have all these people, these poor people, building these houses with no money. We'd all build them together, these big work projects. And it was, I have never been happier in my entire life than I was in that 2.5 frenetic years.
There was a law of consecration.
A law of consecration, everything, yeah.
So your dad got all the money.
Yeah, but I have to say, my dad paid more than he ever got. My dad was really a true disciple of Christ in that I know for a fact he took very little. I mean, on the ballot sheet, he gave a whole lot more to God than he got back from God's fathers. He was not like Warren Jeffs, who fleeces the flock. He was not like a lot of ministers who make a lot. My dad was not that way. I have a lot of issues with my dad, but as far as his word, as far as his honesty, and as far as his sexual habits and ideals, I have nothing but the highest respect for him.
And it sounds like generosity.
To a fault.
And so that was the happiest time of your life, is living the law
No,
of
I didn't say
consecration.
I've never been happier than I was. I would not say it was the happiest time. Okay,
what's the difference?
I'm trying to explain it to you, okay? I lived in this little bubble where my life really actually sucked. But we were preparing for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And there's nothing more powerful in the whole world than to belong to something greater than yourself. That's true happiness in my mind. I was miserable, but I was very happy to be part of this, getting ready for Jesus to come. And every time Dad came up, he would, I'll never forget this one. We're on the main road of Pinestone. It's all dirt roads. And the hill is, it's covered with, we had these roads going across, but they're mud, no gravel, just these mud roads. It's either mud or snow. And my dad looking up at the hill, and he says, and one day we will build our university right there on the crest. And there will be the two roads coming like this, and they'll cross in front of it. And I see a fountain right there. And people will come all over the world to study here. He'd paint that picture, and then he'd talk about Jesus coming. And I really don't know if my dad was lying about this or if he had actually had some sort of visitation. But to him, the reality of people coming through the veil and talking to him, I'm not saying he was like a crazy person, but he would show up in a meeting and he'd just talk about his visitors. And I believed it. I believed that Christ came to see him and talk to him regularly.
So his followers believed that he had talked to Christ?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Did he tell people
No,
that he had talked to Christ?
he was always too humble to say that.
Too humble?
Yeah.
Or wanted them to think what was
This
true?
is what I'm telling you, is I honestly don't know whether he had actually, maybe somebody came to him. I don't believe for a minute it was God.
You don't know, but he never said they did.
No, but he would hint at it. He would hint at it.
That sounds familiar.
Right, very good, very, very good. Oh, we're good. Okay, well, three things. Just let me finish that, and that is that. But every time he come up, he talked about Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, the next week. If not next week, the next month. Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. I'm paraphrasing, but literally every single talk he gave for 5 years, that was what it was. And then he would get in his car and drive back to Salt Lake, and then we'd all go home and go to sleep because we were just absolutely worn out. He kept his frenetic pace. Out building everything and working, going to these long meetings, having circle prayers like you do in the temple, and praying, and then he was dead, and that all disappeared. And my Uncle Owen took charge, and Uncle Owen was just lost, just absolutely lost. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say, didn't know what to think. He had no vision. He received no visions. All he talked about is how much I miss Rulon, how much I miss Rulon. So the AUB group just floated for years. And it was the memory of my father that held things together. But then back to my dad, how he would do it. And I have a lot of anger towards him. I'm still trying to get over. But then some of it, I really don't know. I'm trying to give him credit because, in certain things he was just impeccably honest. But what he did to me was, that was dishonest, dishonorable. Okay, so, for example, if I can just talk about this for just a minute. My dad's claim to having the authority, just this tortured claim to having the authority. And I'm an historian. I became an historian because of it. My dream was to become a doctor, like my dad. We were a real doctor, medical doctor, but Dad didn't want me to become a medical doctor. He talked me out of marrying the girl I'd fallen in love with. I left her, dropped her, broke her heart. And I married this beautiful little 16-year-old girl that had just recently joined the group. And she's from this wonderful church family. She's Donald Ripplinger's niece, the Tabernacle Choir director. That's who. And of course, her greater family had no idea. Her mother joined the Allred group and brought her in, and I married her. And my dad sent me off to Montana to get ready for the second coming. And but all I so struggled with is I wanted to be a doctor. But my dad convinced me that Jesus wanted me not to become a doctor and to go build the United Order instead. And I said, I want to study medicine. And he says, well, study the gospel instead, never dreaming that I really would. And I'm an academician, not because I'm brilliant or smart, but just because I like to do it. And so I started reading all the history of the church. So I was 19 years old, and I bought all the history of the church by Joseph Smith. You've seen the blue volumes, by the black volumes, the B.H. Roberts' Comprehensive History of the Church, Orson F. Whitney's History of Utah. I bought the biographies of all leaders. I bought all of them, and I read them all my first year I was married. Them all those books. Not because I'm smart or whatever, I just wanted to know. And that's when I discovered I have this absolutely freaky memory. I don't remember lines and verses. I couldn't become an actor, for example. But I can quote you chapters and page numbers till the cows come home. And then I started studying Mormon history. And I found that it backed my dad's position. And I came to realize that the church before 1890 is not the same church that it is after 1890. And it's really 1887 is the change. That's the year it changed. And polygamy was just heart and core. It was just like, it was the crowning principle. You had to be a polygamist. You had to be a polygamist to make it the high street. You had to be. all the talks, that's what they were about. Every talk, all the time, polygamy. You look at the Journal of Discourses, only Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ are talked more about than polygamy. All the talks. And you look at the fact that no more ever than 3% of the men ever practiced polygamy because it was statistically impossible. And yet a man standing up at the head of the pulpit every week, week after week after week, every congregation throughout Utah, throughout Mormonism, not literally, but you catch the drift. You have to have more than one wife. You have to have more than one. I'm sorry, guys. There are more men than there are women. Obviously, some of you can't have any wife at all for us to have more wives. But, you know, those of you who are getting to make it the highest tree of celestial glory, we have to have more than one wife. You guys kind of forget about it. You go off and you work really hard and you build the communities ever, but you're not going. That's really the attitude. If you read the talks, that's really what they're saying. And I really wish the church had been honest about plural marriage. I really wish they had, because they had these fairy tales about plural marriage. And the greatest one is, you ask anybody, why did the Mormon church practice have plural marriage? I'm asking you, Amy, off the camera.
I was taught that it was because there were more women.
That's a lie. It's an absolute, unequivocal lie.
So tell the listeners what she said.
She said because there were all these extra women. That is not true. There was a shortage of women in Utah. Look at any of the censuses. There was always a shortage of women in Utah. It was dangerous to be a woman think about it. It's dangerous to be a woman in the frontier. The number one cause of death for women was getting run over by wagon wheels. The second greatest cause of death for women was burning to death by having their long clothes getting caught on fire. And the third was childbirth. There was a shortage of women. Now, if we need to live plural marriage because we all have all these extra surplus women, oh, you're talking about 2016 in my stake, in my ward. There are 37 beautiful women who are single and will never get married because they're not men qualified enough to take them back to the celestial kingdom to marry in the temple. They can't get married because there aren't enough qualified men. It's true today. It was never true in 1856 or 1876 or 96. It was never true then. There was a shortage of women. However, there was a surplus of righteous women who were not willing to marry beneath themselves. Hear what I just said? There was a shortage of righteous women not willing to marry beneath themselves.
Surplus.
There weren't that many of them. Speaking about the whole church. But you think about women, like I mentioned Heidi Swinton, for example. You know, there are dozens of other women, you know, hundreds of women in the children. You know, Sister Do, Sherry Do. Think of all these dynamic, powerful, wonderful, brilliant women who will never get married. Why? You can't find anybody. In the 19th century, that was not true. Guess who those women all married? I'm going to marry me and marry the quorum of 12 apostles. I don't want just anybody. And so the men who were leaders of the church, I actually did my thesis on this. Mormon Polygamy in the Manifesto of 1890, a study of hegemony and social conflict. I was the very first person ever in history to write a thesis on the Manifesto. Can you believe that? I was shocked. 1984.
Where?
University of Montana. I was doing my work up there, and I thought, I'd like to do a manifesto, because I don't claim to be an expert on Mormon polygamy, but if anybody knows more about 19th century Mormon polygamy than I do, I want to talk to that person and say, seriously, dude, you need therapy and you need to get a life. Because I wasted so much of my life studying it. And
so you were talking about how your dad disappointed you or upset you.
So I'm coming to this. And so he convinced me to study the gospel instead. But the more I studied, the more his calling didn't make sense. The more I studied, the more impossible it was for him to hold the keys. And I won't get into these to you, but I had this list of 21 problems, any one of which was difficult, but 5 of them were just catastrophic. They were the death nails to my death.
You were like the B.H. Roberts of the Allred.
I was. Thank you very much. That is the greatest compliment you could possibly tell me. And he was my idol. I studied all of his works. I studied his methodology. I studied how he did his history, his analysis of the past. And he was my guy. And so I became like B.H. Roberts, and I started using the same, because he talked about his study of history and how he analyzed it. That's how I became an historian. I'm an historian. And so I would study the gospel. And so every night I'd come home from work and I'd spend time with my beautiful wives and kids, and then they'd go to bed and I'd sit up and I'd read. Every night. I'd get up in the morning and I'd read. I probably had only 6 hours sleep, so I just had to learn. And every time my dad came up, I had a list. I had a yellow pad of questions. And so think about it. Sure, my dad had 500 followers up there But every time he came up, he had to come to see his son to put the wheels back on my wagon. So I started really getting upset. And by this time, I'd been married this was 1974 when this event happened. I'd been married for almost 3 years, had 2 wives, 2 kids, and my mother would come up with my dad. My mother was my father's oldest wife, legal wife, and she was kind of like the matriarch, and she loved everybody. And she would come up, and she'd always stay with me. And I would tell her my problems. And she says, well, I have no idea. You'll have to talk to your father. And I said, well, he's too busy to talk to me. He has all these other followers. And she says, well, I'll make sure he sees you. And so every time Dad came up, he had to go see Myrtle's son. And so he'd actually come find me on my work project where I was, and we'd go back to my house. And I know I just absolutely tortured him. I wasn't trying to be obnoxious. I just wanted the truth.
You were having a fundamentalist crisis of faith.
I was, a fundamentalist crisis of faith. And he would give me the answers. And I said, okay. And so he'd leave, and I'd sit down his answers and look at him. And this went on for months. And I know he'd just think, oh my God. Because there were no answers.
That sounds very familiar.
Because it's fatally flawed. Okay, so there were 5 things that greatly troubled me about my father's position. And here again, my position too, because I committed my life to it. And the first one, of course, was simply the fact that how could the keys that were given by God to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery have left the church and gone to my father? And because all of those have been recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, the dates, times, places, and they've been witnessed as being scripture and been recognized by the whole church. And yet there was no record anywhere specifically of how my father got the keys or the instances except for in my Aunt Melba's diary. The most important thing out of it, the problem number 1 was it just didn't seem fair to me that God would call a prophet and hide him away in Murray, Utah. And every other prophet, Moses, Elijah, Samuel, they all go out and cry from the wilderness, come out and hear me talk and cry repentance in the entire world. It just wasn't fair that God would give all the keys to this man and then hide him away so nobody knew where the prophet was. That's not the purpose of the prophet. And the others they're all historical or doctrinal problems, but any one of them is just totally fatal to my father's claim. And most of them are, of course, historical or doctrinal, and there's just absolutely no way to overcome them. I kept trying to overcome those problems, and I couldn't, looking through all the history and everything that I had. And I remember just finding the look on my dad's face. He sat there, and he kind of like that. Finally looked at me, and it kind of shifted, and he said, son, if you knew that the Lord's servant had seen the Savior, would that be enough? I said, if I knew the Lord's servant had seen the Savior, would that be enough? He says, yes, would that be enough? This is what Dad, whenever he would go into prophet mode, he'd always go into third person. I said, yeah. So then he leaned forward and he gave me this beatific smile. How does the Lord's servant know that the Lord lives? How do I know you live? I've seen your face. I've heard your voice. I felt your hands. I know the Lord lives. The Lord's servant knows the Lord lives. And that to me was just my dad admitting he'd seen the Savior.
But he would never just say it.
Oh, no, heavens no, because that would be irreverent, that would be assuming too much, that would be self-aggrandizing, it would be prideful. He was just too humble to do that.
So as you're thinking back, trying to guess, was he lying to you? Did he believe it?
And my answer is yes. I don't know. I believe he had some serious mental health issues. I really do.
Like what?
I'm not a psychologist, but it would seem to me that there's definitely. He was really big into the conspiracy theories. He would have voted for Donald Trump big time. And the only thing, he did not believe the Jewish Holocaust was a conspiracy. He believed that one was for real. But all the others, I mean, you name a conspiracy. JFK wasn't really assassinated. They just hit him. He's working in a barbershop in Ontario or someplace. You know what I'm saying? And so I cannot honestly say either he was an outright liar who lied to my face, which is what I thought for a long time, and I became the day that I realized it was all a lie, I was so angry with him. I wanted to go dig him up and slug him. I was so angry with him. But the crazy thing happened is that when I became convinced that he had seen the Savior, I know he was expecting that I would just kind of chill back, lie back, and say, okay. But no, not me. The B.H. Roberts in me, I had to figure out how. There has to be a way for the keys to get outside the priesthood to my Father, to get outside of the church to get to my Father. There has to be a way. And so I spent the next 18 years studying and studying and studying and studying, trying to figure out how and why. And so eventually I was able to overcome those arguments or plug the hole. And because I turned it around, it wasn't, this is priesthood doctrine. This is the scriptures. How in the world can Rulon Allred hold the keys? I turned around, Rulon Allred holds the keys. He holds them. That's my absolute truth. Now I have to figure out how I can explain bridging the gap to get back to the scriptures so that I can say this is how it happened. These are the supports.
And that's how apologists work. They start with the truth that they want to defend.
Absolutely.
And then they make up whatever justifications they can to support the truth they've already decided to believe.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's when I really became a fanatical student of Mormon history, particularly anything dealing with the quote-unquote fullness of the gospel, those parts of the gospel of Jesus Christ as revealed through the prophet Joseph Smith that the church had surrendered partial or in whole between 1830, Joseph Smith's beginning of the church, and 1927 when, not just 19, it was really the 1918 when Joseph F. Smith died. It's kind of like, those things, the memory of them was just all gone. And there was a brand new church in 1918. Most people don't realize that, but there was. And
New church, why?
New church, the very nature of God. Joseph Smith said the first principle of the gospel is knowing the character and nature of God Himself. Faith, flex, on faith, and Joseph Smith said whenever the gospel has been revealed, has been through Adam. Whenever the Savior has been introduced, it's been through Adam. When has the Savior been introduced? It's been introduced 3 times. This is my son, in whom I am well pleased. Joseph, this is my son. Hear him. Whose voice was speaking? God the Father, who Joseph Smith said was Adam.
Joseph Smith said that.
No, yeah. See, Joseph Smith says whenever Jesus Christ has been revealed, He's always been through the voice of Adam. Adam has revealed Him. Page 389, volume 3. But there have only been 3 times the voice of. There's only been 3 times Jesus Christ has been revealed from heaven. All 3 of them were Adam, according to Joseph Smith.
So Brigham Young got it from Joseph.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind. Brigham Young didn't make up the Adam God doctrine. It's Joseph Smith made up the Adam God doctrine.
From the Journal of Discourses is our source.
But it also History of the Church, the blue volumes, Documentary History of the Church, the 7 volumes, 6 by Joseph Smith, volume 3, page 389. It's right there. Right there. It cannot be denied. People can excuse that away. I was a polygamist fundamentalist apologist, granted, but the church has thousands of apologists. They've been trying to paper over that one for years, and they cannot do it. Joseph Smith taught the Adam God doctrine. Today you get excommunicated for believing in it. That's a conundrum to me. So the man who saw Jesus Christ, and the Father, says that God and Adam are the same person. But Thomas Monson will excommunicate him from the church if you say that.
And you're saying Joseph F. Smith was the one who turned us away from that?
No, at his death, it was never spoken of again. I'm not saying he turned it. It's kind of like
he was loyal to it.
I can't say that he was loyal to it, but I don't know that anybody ever got excommunicated for believing in it. After his death, when Heber J. Grant became president of the church, men began to be excommunicated for believing in that doctrine when it had been taught at the veil. For years at the temple, it was taught at the veil. The Adam God doctrine was correct, and suddenly it changed.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm making any sense to you.
So new church with Heber J. Grant.
Yeah, read it.
Because the nature of God, who God is, changes.
Right, but everything else, the ordinance is the same. Everything looks the same, sounds the same, except that, to me, that was such a disconnect. Joseph Smith goes into the grove to see God the Father. He sees God the Father and the Son, Jesus Christ, and he tells us, volume 3, page 3. I keep repeating it, but go read it. He's very, very, very clear. The voice of Adam. And then Brigham Young, the prophet, seer and revelator, who guided the sage. Everybody loves Brigham Young. He's a great pioneer, but don't listen to what he said about polygamy or the Adam God doctrine, or we will excommunicate him.
Okay.
That's a biggie to me. I'm trying to explain to you how I was able to make it all work, okay? And so then I, based on the premise then the dad did have the keys, and so then I became an apologist. And so I started writing all my ideas down. And those ideas that I wrote down, that's what every fundamentalist polygamist group in the world uses now, is the stuff I wrote.
Can you summarize it?
Yeah, it's all shit.
What?
It's garbage.
The stuff you came up with.
Yeah. It's
So
not,
you,
okay,
the
what
author of this apologetic justification
yeah,
is now
it's
saying...
BS. Because it's all tortured and strained. Because I started out with the premise. I violated every premise of scientific observation, and I violated the first premise of historical review and analysis. I acknowledge that. See, but I wasn't trying to do it as an historical scholar. I was trying to do it as the son of the prophet who was trying to bear witness to my father actually held the keys, because my father had told me that he held the keys. And when you start out with the mindset, you know this is how it is, it's amazing. It is amazing. It's like, I think of all the good Mormons I know who have convinced themselves to vote for Donald Trump. It's the same kind of absolute idiocy that your mind is able to do to convince yourself, well, this is how it is. Because, you see, I had to make it work. Because everybody else in the AUB group, they just got a testimony and that was it. And I'm not that way. I had to know. I had to know how it could happen, how the keys could get there. And so then, fast forward this, so much to my story that's essential, but I won't talk.
Can you tell us the justification?
The justification what?
What was it?
Well, just real briefly.
Summarize it.
Okay, real briefly, I went through it historically, went back to, and I looked at the absolute hinge point of how important plural marriage was. And that, you know, Joseph Smith Joseph Smith taught it to, you know, there's so many things about it. How to make a summary of this really quickly. All the things that are said about Joseph Smith detract him about being an adulterer. I don't believe any of those. I don't. Either because if Joseph Smith was a liar, Heber C. Kimball was a liar, Brigham Young was a liar, John Taylor was a liar, or Surprise, they're all liars. So either Joseph Smith was an honest, honorable man who was a prophet of God and who didn't lie, or they all lied. Because if he lied, they all lied. If he didn't lie, they didn't lie. And so it has to be one of the two. I'm saying as an historian, I choose to believe that Joseph Smith did not commit adultery. I believe he married dozens of women. He married over 100 women. They were young women, 14, 15, 16 years old, which makes me absolutely want to puke. It really distresses me, because that's the same age my father was. My father was 38 years old, and he married a 15-year-old. And I remember when I was 38 years old, my daughter Tara became a very good friend with the young lady who was my Uncle Owen's step-granddaughter. I remember looking at that little girl, and it just made me sick to think about it. You know, I don't know if it makes sense to you. The thought of, first of all, why in the world would I want to spend time with a 14-year-old girl? It's kind of like, you know, whatever. I like spending time with my wife, you know, because she's smart, she's intelligent, she has my experiences. The thoughts of having to spend time with this, you know, this young girl she's a sweet girl, but I talk about sheer boredom, you know, slash my wrist with a dull fork. But then, I don't dwell on that, but the thoughts of being intimate with her just gave me the creeps and the willies.
And you're saying Joseph
Smith definitely
believed he was practicing God's polygamy.
For real. He really honestly did. So I believe he had convinced himself, either he actually received revelations from God and he was told to marry those young girls, which gives me the creeps, or he did it on his own, which gives me the creeps.
I mean, maybe he's reading the Old Testament,
right,
and he sees that the Old Testament prophets, he needs to restore all things. He's having these sexual feelings that he doesn't understand. So he bridges that and says, wow, it must be that I'm called by God to restore all things, including plural marriage, because the Old Testament prophets did it.
Right, but I can't cross that gap. To me, he's a prophet and revelator.
Wait, you're saying your beliefs now?
Yeah, still. I have never stopped believing in Joseph Smith. Okay? I know it's illogical, and I know that it's irrational, but for whatever reason, see, I studied his life. If there's anything written about Joseph Smith, I read it, and I have so much respect, so much admiration for him, and what he did, what he accomplished, and so I'm admitting to you, logically and rationally, I know that I'm being illogical and I'm being irrational, and I know that my supporting him, and by saying that I believe he's a prophet, it's because I still can't get away from the Book of Mormon rush. That's what I call it, Moroni chapter 10, verse 4. I received that witness that the Book of Mormon is true. That's the only thing, that is the only thing in the entire world that I can say unequivocally that I know to be true. the Book of Mormon is true. But what does it mean that it's true? Do I believe that they're literal descendants of the tribe of Israel? Well, we know what happened to the professors of biology and genetics at the University of Brigham Young who proved that there's no connection. You get excommunicated from the church. Oh, wherever heard that happen? Can people get excommunicated in believing? Whatever.
Okay, so you're saying that because you believe that Joseph was told to practice polygamy, that polygamy is essential.
No, I do not believe that.
What?
I don't believe
We're talking about how you defended the principle for so long.
Okay, no, I'm not saying...
Justification for that. Your argument was that polygamy is essential, right?
I believe that was my argument. I don't believe that. I don't believe
that was your argument. So we were talking about your argument
about
of how you justify.
Okay, right. Okay, and so all of my arguments for why it was all true, they were all based on the fallacy that my dad held the keys. And so the whole structure just simply collapses. It simply collapses because every single piece of evidence I used, every argument, every article, every quote, every analysis I gave was based on a flawed premise.
Right, but I just want you to construct it really quickly. So polygamy had to have been essential.
Okay, polygamy had to have been essential.
So
polygamy had to have been essential.
So the keys couldn't have been taken away.
Because if polygamy was essential in the 19th century, because the gospel of Jesus Christ is eternal and it is given the same to all men of all dispensations at all times, it must be necessary to all times at all people.
So it had to have continued.
It had to have continued.
And then how'd you draw the line to your dad?
And so then I began to be just stretching it. I tried to find, well...
How did you stretch it?
How I stretched it was finding this point that it had to be passed directly from the man who held the keys had to designate his successor. The successor was not necessarily senior. In fact, usually was not. He just simply leapfrogged him to go down to the next man that he was going to choose. He leapfrogged.
And so traces the succession as you had justified
Okay, so as I justified it was that it was that Joseph F. Smith had the keys. And shortly before Joseph F. Smith's death, he was visited by John W. Woolley, which is a fact. John W. Woolley came into Joseph F. Smith's house. And therefore I deduced from that must have been, because in order for my dad to hold the keys, John W. Woolley had to have them. Because that's the only way. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
And so I deduced from that, I stretched and I tortured the thought that, well, the only reason why he went there was so Joseph F. Smith could say, when I'm gone, you are the next one.
Around what year?
This would have been 1918.
Wow, way later.
Oh, yeah. Okay, but let me kind of go through this with you, okay? Shortly before Joseph Smith died, he received Section 124 in 1841, which bypassed Oliver Cowdery and then gave all the keys that Oliver Cowdery had to Hiram Smith. But shortly before Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith died together, Joseph Smith said, where I am not, Brigham Young is. Brigham Young will be next. He will guide the church. So everybody knew that it was going to be him. Joseph Smith and died. Had Hiram Smith not been there, Hiram Smith would have been the next president of the church. But he died with him, so that's Brigham Young. Brigham Young and John Taylor did not see eye to eye. A lot of friction between these two men. The last year of Brigham Young's life, the summer before he died, he's down in southern Utah with John Taylor. And there was actually some public friction, and Brigham Young kind of denounced John Taylor again in front of everybody. But then he went over to John Taylor's house that night, and he talked to John Taylor, and they made peace. And then the next week, Brigham Young said, after I am gone, when I am not, it will be John Taylor. And that he then reorganized the Quorum of 12 Apostles, because the Quorum of 12 Apostles was Brigham Young, and then Heber C. Kimball. When Heber C. Kimball died, then it was Orson Hyde, and then Orson Pratt, both of whom were first from the original Quorum of 12 Apostles, and then Wilford Woodruff, and then John Taylor. And the reason why is that the first Quorum of 12 Apostles, they're all called on February 14th, 1835, but then they were not sequenced in order of ordination. Lyman White was actually ordained first, but they were later sequenced in order of age. You're nodding your head when I'm talking about it. So 1839, Section 118 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord calls, we call for John E. Page, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, and Willard Richards. And John Taylor was the next one to actually be confirmed to be an apostle. But when Wilford Woodruff was ordained an apostle at Far West, John Taylor actually laid his hands on Wilford Woodruff's head. But when Joseph Smith sequenced the Quorum of 12 Apostles, Wilford Woodruff was put in front of John Taylor because he was older. John Taylor said nothing. In 1838, that same year, Orson Hyde apostatized and left the church. He came back. Joseph Smith reinstated him. 1841, almost positively because of the Joseph Smith Testament. Joseph Smith called them to all live the Quorum of 12, all called the Quorum of 12 apostles together and gave them the commandment to practice polygamy. We've all heard the story about how agitated they were, and Heber C. Kimball's wife, late, got this message. Well, Leonora Cannon's Taylor was so upset with John Taylor, she threw something and broke a window, and she lost her finger because of it breaking the window. Orson Pratt became very bitter and very angry. Orson Pratt was actually excommunicated from the church. He was out of the church for 11 days. He was brought back in and reinstated in his position. I think it was less than 2 months before Brigham Young dies, he gets the Quorum of 12 apostles together. He said, John Taylor sits number 4. He's number 1. And he explained why.
Who? Brigham's number?
Brigham Young. This is after they made peace down in St. George. Then he resequenced the quorum. John Taylor's first, then Wilford Woodruff. Even though you're older, he called you Brother Pratt. Brother Hyde, you were out of the church. You lost your position. You came back in. Brother Pratt, you lost your position. You were back in. In fact, they actually slid down behind some of the guys who came in before. Am I making sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. And so that's how John Taylor got it. Okay. And so then Wilford Woodruff has it. I know because he was publicly, declared by John Taylor. Wilford Woodruff acknowledged that his successor would be Lorenzo Snow. He acknowledged his successor would be Joseph F. Smith. Well, there's no public declaration. So this is really a hard one for me. Really hard one for me. And I finally constructed it to be that the church had chosen to give up plural marriage. They had like the analogy. This is really weak, okay? But it's like when Samuel tells the people, God doesn't want you to have a king. No, we want a king. We want a king. No, we don't want a king. We want a king. Okay, you can have a king. And I use that analogy of this is, that's how it went from Joseph F. Smith. Heber J. Grant was just a bad guy. He wasn't willing to do it, to step up. And that was really hard for me because I had absolute highest esteem for Heber J. Grant. My father never said a good thing about him. Heber J. Grant was the first one to start the persecution of the polygamists. I can see why my dad didn't like him. And he was president of the church in 1944 when my dad was arrested. He died in 1945. So I can understand that. But later, I studied Heber J. Grant's life. I fell in love with the man. Talk about impeccable character, wisdom, and a Christ-like attitude. Being involved in the persecution of polygamists. That's still hard for me today. But just like Thomas S. Mont's persecution of people, children of gay marriages, is still really hard for me. But I got through that, and so then I had to do some other gymnastics of how then it bounced around in the different fundamentalist groups, and ironically, I'm the one who created the doctrine of, as is articulated, worthy seeing of apostle, because my dad was bypassed. Joseph Musser bypassed several other men to appoint my dad. Then after my dad's death, it's Owen Allred. Well, there's a crisis in the Allred group today. I don't know if you've heard of it. Have you heard of the crisis in the Allred group? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Tell us.
Okay. So my Uncle Owen's death, this is so tragic. I'm responsible for this. It's my fault. Okay. So I created this doctrine. I explained it to everybody, and so let me give you this little aside. In 1989, I came to my Uncle Owen's attention. Now he knew who I was and whatever, but I lived in Montana. He was in Salt Lake, and he'd never really.
So Owen takes over for your dad.
Yeah, he took over my dad in 1977. This is 12 years later.
And you're doing what during this?
Well, in this period of time, while I was, doing my business, so I got badly injured in a construction accident. I got to go to college because of it. I became a teacher because of it. And that's how I learned how to study history and learned how to do all this analysis.
And you are still believing? Oh,
yeah, I was still living. I was still fully practiced.
But your dad's dead.
My dad was dead.
But the church is what?
No, I believed it. I believed my uncle was my father's successher and that he held all the keys.
So he was the prophet.
Owen Allred was the prophet.
And you just got injured, studying, becoming a teacher. Okay.
And but then there was this conflict within the council between Joseph Thompson and Owen Allred. And Joseph Thompson became aware of me, and he knew I could, I was an eloquent speaker, and I could really convince people, if I tried to, if I want to, and so there was so Joe Thompson, he was Uncle Owen's rival. They were supposed to be together, but there was this intense rivalry between them, a lot of arguing between them, and Joe Thompson had begun using me. That's my phone. And Joseph Thompson began using me. He was taking me with him, and he would have me talk. He would tell people that I was his Aaron, this kind of stuff like this. And
so you're betraying your uncle.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to. And it's really crazy because the council, they always publicly say, oh, we're totally united.
That sounds familiar.
We're totally united. But, backroom brawls, the screaming. I'll tell you later, at council meeting, they would actually scream at each other, of course. But that I would find that out later. But so Uncle Owen, Joe Thomas was in charge of preaching meeting that night. And he asked me to come up and teach. Just cold turkey. So I want you to come up and teach this lesson. I got up and I said, what do you want to talk about? He said, just do whatever. So I talked real basic, talking about the law of grace. Just talked about grace, explain what it was. Because my dad never taught grace. Polygamists do not believe in grace, by the way. They believe you get to heaven because you earn it. This is the greatest difference between fundamentalists and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints teaches by grace alone you are saved after all you can do. They may not really believe that, totally. They teach it. Fundamentalist groups do not believe that. You have to earn your way into heaven by obeying all the commandments. So anyway, I gave that lesson. Then after I was done, I came on stage, and my uncle had, I had a wife, pro-wife, who left me, and in the process of that, my name just got turned in the mud. It was awful. And my Uncle Owen always believed the worst of me. Then I came down off that stage, and he looked at me, and I had tears streaming down his face. He says, "You are your father's son," which is a stupid thing to say, but it was profound to him. But suddenly I was the guy. I could do no wrong. And he started taking me with him everywhere. And then 3 weeks later, he made me Bruce R. McConkie of the Fundamentalist Group.
Owen did?
Mm-hmm. I was suddenly the guy.
The guy who knew all the doctrine.
Right. And whatever I said, Owen said. He started having all of my talks recorded and transcribed and passed out. Total, there are 19 volumes of them. And I talked about history. I talked about basic gospel doctrine. And most of it really is, it's well researched, it's well documented, it's well written, well spoken. Because I went back and I edited it, and then I took out the flaws in speaking and whatnot. And it's really a very good read. But I'm telling you, it's all totally flawed. When I say it's BS, I mean it's flawed. It's just ultimately flawed because it's based on the premise that my father held the keys. Okay, but in the process, then I explain how that it doesn't pass through seniority of ordination. It passes through worthiness. Who's the most worthy? Who's the most worthy? Well, the Revelation of 1880, Wilford Woodruff in 1880 when Brigham Young died in 1877, they did not reorganize the Quorum of 12 Apostles for quite some time. And when Joseph Smith died in 1844, Brigham Young didn't reorganize it until December of 1847. So it went for 3.5 years with the Quorum of 12 Apostles leaving the church, and the first presidency was in abeyance. And the same thing happened when John Taylor became president of the church, and they didn't do anything for 3 years. And finally, and when it was almost 3 years, they asked Wilford Woodruff to go get a revelation, and he did it. In that revelation, the words were that all the members of the Quorum of 12 Apostles hold the keys conjointly in coordination with each other. But they are of one mind with each other. But the Lord calls them all to the quorum. And then, in essence, these are my words, whoever lives longest is the head. Whoever lives longest, he says, because those whom I call home, I choose to call home. In other words, if I call them home, I don't want to be head of the church. And therefore, whoever survives is the one that I chose because I allowed him to live. I'm paraphrasing. I'm speaking. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but that's really what it says. And so, then it goes from Wilford Woodruff to Lorenzo Snow, Joseph S. Smith, and, well, wait a minute. Why doesn't it go? Why doesn't it go on down then to Heber J. Grant, which he should have done?
Because he gave it to Messer.
Yeah. Well, he gave it to Warren Woolley, who eventually gave it to Musser. But then Musser had to bypass these guys down in Colorado City, Leroy Johnson, Rulon Jeffs. He bypassed them all to give it to my father. So I'm saying, well, the same thing happened there. And so I come up with this historical examples. They're not really examples because they're really not direct correlations. They're not corollaries at best, but there's certainly no definitive proof. But so Owen says, do I have the right then to choose my successor? And I said, well, absolutely. So he bypassed my Uncle Marvin. He bypassed Marvin Jessup. And he says, Lemoyne Jensen will be my successor. Why could he do that? Because I told him he could. So now Lemoyne Jensen is getting ready to die. Marvin Jessup is supposed to be his successor. Marvin's been passed over once already, okay? Lemoyne Jensen is on his deathbed, and my brother-in-law, Lynn Thompson, who's married to my former brother-in-law, and he and another guy named Harry Bonnell, they go to see Lemoyne Jensen. Nobody's with them. Oh, but they're together. I guess this will be the two witnesses. They come out, Lemoyne's
Finally,
dead.
witnesses matter.
Yeah. They come out, well, Lemoyne's dead, but before he died, he said I was his successor. And Harry's my first counselor and my first witness. And the people in Pinesville go, say what? Because Marvin's already been passed over once. And there are all of these accusations that Lynn Thompson was a child molester, pedophile, and there have been more than a few girls, almost all his nieces or his daughters come and say, well, he did it to me. I don't know about that, but I do know that I had two of my sisters. These were Athleen's daughters, the Marilyn Monroe with the brown hair. These are two of Athleen's daughters, both who left Lynn Thompson. I don't care about anything else. My sisters can't stand to be married to the guy. I don't care. I mean, that's my litmus test. Okay. And so now then Lynn Thompson now claims I'm the one, and so the Allred group is just fragmented to pieces. And so here's Pinesdale, Montana, and it's literally broken in half because most of the people who live there, guess what their last name is? It's Jessup. And what's happened to Marvin Jessup? Well, he's been pushed aside.
Yeah.
And now there's not an apostle up there. There's nobody who's in charge up there. So I was up there just last week, and it's heartbreaking. So I'll go see my sisters. You know, I have two sisters on one side and two sisters on the other side. And it's ugly, and it's sad. And I feel somewhat responsible for that because the reason why Marvin Jessup isn't head of the Allred group today is because I told Owen he could bypass him.
Did you have a motive in doing that?
No, not at all.
You just believe that was...
Well, you see, because in order for my dad to be head of the priesthood, that has to be a correct principle. It has to be, because that's the only way my dad could be the prophet. First of all, it defies logic. It defies reason. It defies history. And it defies principle. And most importantly, it defies basic gospel doctrine. But a fundamentalist don't worry too much about that kind of stuff.
So we have all sorts of apologists in the LDS Church today. Daniel Peterson, Louis Midgley, Brian Hales, lots of people. Some are even saying that sort of Terrell Gibbons or Richard Bushman are sort of new apologists, or Patrick Mason or whatever. They all start with the belief that the LDS Church is true, and then they come up with whatever justification they feel or believe to then bolster it. You were that for a long time. So as someone who was the apologist, now you're looking back, what's it like to have created all that and have so many people have believed that and even have had important church decisions made based on that logic and your justifications, and now to look back and say it was all malarkey? What's that like for you?
I lost a lot of sleep, honestly.
Was it hard for you to admit that for a while?
Oh, heavens, no. Well, yeah. Well, as soon as fast forward. There's so many things going on. I'm doing this. This is 1989. I became Owen's right-hand man. 1991. So, I only had one wife. It was my dad, got me involved in 3 marriages. Again, my first one, Tana, I'm still madly in love with her, and we have the fairy tale romantic.
She's still your wife?
Yeah, she's Lance's mother. She's the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to me, multiplied 100 times.
And it's your first wife?
She's my first wife, my first love. And then Dad talked me into marrying another girl, and 11 months later, and she was married to me for 8 weeks, and then she ran off with a beekeeper from Hamilton. She was very promiscuous. I didn't know that she was. Dad didn't tell me that. He wanted me to save her. He thought if I married her, I could exalt her. It was terrible. Then I married another girl a year later, and that's how I won't get into that, because I'm not going to say anything negative about it, because she and I have 3 wonderful children together, and I'm proud of all of them. One lives here in Salt Lake City, and she has a granddaughter. We love people unconditionally. People say, who do you love the most? Tana's kids are calling. I don't love them. I love them all completely. I love them all completely. So therefore, I love them all the same. I'd die for anyone. I'd give my heart, anything for anyone. So
for your wives?
No, for my children.
For the children.
For my children. I would do that for Tana, but I wouldn't do it for the children of the mother of my 3 other children. But I'm saying, so I choose not to say anything negative about my third wife. But she's a very remarkable person. She's accomplished a lot of great things. She got a master's of public health from Yale University since she left me. I have tremendous
Yale University?
Yes, I have tremendous respect for her.
Holy moly.
Holy moly, yeah. Tell me about it. I'm extremely proud of her and what she's done.
Polygamists have done well for yourselves.
Yeah. And I have a master's degree from the University of Utah. My wife also has a master's degree from the University of Utah in education. We had to do that in spite of my dad. My dad didn't want any of us to go to college. And so that's my story as far as...
Did he want to keep people ignorant?
Oh, absolutely. No, he didn't want to keep us ignorant. He wanted to protect us.
From?
He would actually do that.
He would.
Yeah,
And he's protecting you from what?
all that evil out there that might confuse you.
Because he didn't want you learning because...
No, he didn't want us deceived.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be funny. This is how we would respond to all of these kinds of things. No, I'm doing it for your good. I wouldn't want to limit you. I wouldn't want to put any kind of restraints on you. I just know how close I came to falling away, and I just don't know if you could withstand the temptation. I'm just grateful I was able to. Because he'd always do it in such a way that would make you feel like he loved you and he was looking out for you, but he would point out to you very clearly that he was superior to us because he had the strength to withstand all of those things. My greatest dream as a kid was to be a medical doctor. I wanted to be a medical doctor. That was my dream. That was my passion to become a medical doctor. I don't know that I would have done it. I graduated first in my class from University of Montana, so I'm not an idiot. My oldest daughter, who is a medical doctor, on her first day she came back from gross anatomy, and she said, "Dad, you would never have made it." I probably wouldn't have made it. I probably would have realized soon on that as soon as that wasn't my cup of tea, and I'm really good at history and teaching. But that should have been my choice.
So when you were saying earlier about frustrations with your dad, it's number one that he didn't let you become what you wanted to become.
Absolutely, yeah.
What are, if you had to just give high level, what are some of the other criticisms you have of
He lied to me. He knowingly, rationally, deliberately lied to me.
About what?
Of seeing God face to face.
How do you know?
Because I know he didn't see him.
How do you know?
Because I've seen the fruits of his labor. I've experienced the damage. I've experienced the pain he's brought to my life. A servant of God, following the teachings of a prophet of God would not have brought me that destruction in my life. I look at...
What about all the people that Joseph Smith, what about all the people whose lives were affected or even destroyed because of Joseph Smith?
And my response to that is that people are responsible for their individual choices, what they do, just like people are responsible for the choices today. There are people in the church like me who say, I love the church, I love its teachings, but I cannot support your position, your stand on children of gay marriages. I can't do that. And I can't be part of it. I realize I'm putting myself beyond the pale. I realize I'm saying that. But to me, it's an individual thing.
But you're saying that you don't believe your dad saw Jesus because there was too much pain that came from him.
Right.
But you don't apply that same logic to Joseph Smith.
Because I haven't. No, I do not.
Because why?
I don't. Because to me, I understand where you're going, and it would be.
I'm just curious.
Right. I'm simply saying it's kind of like when people hear about Donald Trump and he saw those women right away. Well, Bill Clinton did it. Well, Bill Clinton did not do that. Bill Clinton.
They're different categories. You're saying
different categories.
The categories of
they're similar.
Sadness that your dad brought onto people was a totally order of magnitude more significant than Joseph.
But most importantly, Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon. So therefore, in my mind, I still believe the Book of Mormon is true. Therefore, I believe if he did fall away, if he was diminished, at some point, he had that all. He had the Urim and Thummim. And this is Vance Allred talking. Yes, I still believe in that. Most of my children do not.
Okay, no, we'll get to that.
But I do.
Okay, so other complaints about your dad? He lied to you. He wouldn't let you become who you wanted to become. Yeah. Anything else major?
Well, yeah, he chose who I should marry.
Right.
But then he put men in power that he knew were doing some awful things. My dad knew that Joe Thompson had these accusations because it was his nieces. His nieces were married to Joe. And they were telling my dad these things. And he chose not to believe them. He chose to ignore them. And so I don't believe my dad had any authority at all. I don't believe my Uncle Owen held it. I don't believe Joseph Musser held it at all. And I fell in love with Gordon B. Hinckley, though. I really did.
You went back to
crossed that out.
Illinois.
Yeah.
Okay.
you know, and then "O Ye Mountains High" by the Christian Judge Charles Penrose hymn. "O Ye Mountains High," and what is the verse? I can't remember. I have to have the hymn book, but it says one verse it said. The original verse was every knee shall bow
And tongue confess.
and confess, and that's been changed out. That's been made politically correct. But the other thing, but my dad knew the scriptures. He knew them backwards and forwards. Of course, he could. It's amazing though, because I realized later, and I'm embarrassed with this. When my dad would read the scriptures, and what really came to me. Fast forward a long time later, it was actually after I joined the LDS Church, and our mentors were Jeff and Heidi Swinton, wonderful people. I don't know, she's the one who wrote the biography of President Monson. She also wrote the Trail of the Joseph Smith biography, one that was made a documentary. But they were our mentors. They lived on our block. But I kept having this problem with this thing about ordinances and important it was. And I read it to Jeff, and I kept reading it to him. And it says that those who do not have the ordinance, without these, they cannot stand in the presence of God. And finally, Jeff handed it 3 times. Vance, read it again. Finally, I realized it didn't say these, it said it. I'd read that scripture hundreds and hundreds of times. I'd taught from that scripture. I'd quoted that scripture. And I always had these, thinking it referred to, there was a pronoun modifying ordinances, but it says it. It's always said it, emphasizing, modifying the priesthood. My point being, there were dozens and dozens of scriptures that my dad would quote just a little bit off to support his position. And even after I got my own scriptures and I started reading them, and after I'd read them all, and I became quite good with the scriptures, even after I joined the LDS Church, became a Main Street Mormon, I still kept quoting and reading them the way my dad had
You
quoted.
were primed.
Exactly.
To see them a certain way.
And finally,
it's
I went.
confirmation bias.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And but I came to realize that he actually that's what he believed, and so he needed to turn things so that they fit his perception.
Okay.
And I realized that we all do that. But the fact that my father, the prophet of God, could do it, that was really jarring to me when I realized that my dad always had a way of explaining it.
So give us just a really brief sort of overview of like how he builds an empire or builds a large group.
It was phenomenal. I was 7 years old when we moved back to Salt Lake City. And he got his entire group together, and I kid you not, they fit in an area smaller than this apartment. Adults, children, everybody.
And the approximate year?
This would have been 1957 to 1963. 1963, we started to get new. People like my mother were never confused. My father's wives were never confused. But pretty soon, a whole bunch of people started, including me. We all became confused. You know, when can we lie and when can we not? And it creates a real problem. But at the same time, and Lance talked about this as well, you're in hiding. Think about everything about what going in hiding does to your sense of belief as to who you are relevant to the rest of the world. You're special. And my heroes were Elijah, the prophet who had to hide, Elisha, who was hidden away. And then a story we read about the Jews, and boy, we could relate to that. My dad, unlike most fundamentalists, hate Jews. My dad loved the Jews. He totally supported them. Great fan of the founding of Israel. But that again led to the feeling that we were special because we were persecuted. You know, Jesus says, "Blessed are you," and they spitefully use you and persecute you for. And boy, that was us. That fit us to a T.
So do you think that leads to a culture of deceit?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So that feeds it.
Right, but then it comes to the point, section, the articles, the section 51, for example, says, to obey the law of the land, but section 98 says, I will support you in obeying the laws of the land that are constitutional. So every polygamist is a constitutional attorney. They know it to a T.
It's a way to justify
Oh, absolutely.
breaking the law.
Anything they want they can. Some of my own brothers are like this. They can justify anything. They can every single law there is unconstitutional.
There really is no law.
They have no respect for the law.
Yeah.
My mother, however, was married to Aunt Ethel, and Aunt Mabel's kids and Aunt Etheling's kids were raised like I was. Great respect for the law, but a lot of my siblings were not.
So tell me how. So your dad's building up his own sort of branch
Right.
of during this time.
Right.
Okay, so were you guys meeting in chapels? Did you meet on the frontier? What's What was his church like relative to what a LDS church member would experience?
This guy's really good, you know that? It's right where I was going next. Hey, you are so good. I can't believe it. Okay.
Is this a backhanded compliment?
No, it really is. It's on it. It's pretty good. So picture this. I'll fast forward. I was in my very first day of first grade, September 5th, 1957. I remember it because this is the very first time ever I was around other kids who were not Polygamist kids. First time ever. My mother drops me out of school, and I walk into this room. And most of them were Mormon kids, I realized later. And they're talking back and forth. And finally, one kid looked at me and realized, you don't go to church with us. No. Well, where do you go to church? And I said, in my house. I go to church in my house. And so then we're living in Idaho, in Pocatello, and my mother got a job for Rulon, it's a law firm. My mother was an incredible secretary, stenographer. Boy, could she type. Unbelievable typist. And this was a firm that had the predecessor of the Xerox. You might be old enough to remember when you got a birth certificate, it was white letters on a black background before the Xerox machines came out. And it was a big deal to get a copy. Remember this machine was this big machine about the size of a car. Not really, but when I was in my little kid's eyes, the thing would make all this noise, and this little thing would come out and was still wet, and it was the birth certificate, black background, white print on it. Well, my dad went to prison in 1944, and so he quote-unquote paid the price for the children born before 1944. But then they came to arrest him in 1955, and we had to go into hiding. So none of the children between 1944 and 1955 had a birth certificate except for my mother's 3 sons. My mother had a first son in 1940, and my brother Rex, he's number 24 out of 48. So think about all my dad's kids. The first half were born before her son, and so it came time to get us in school, and you had to have a birth certificate to get into school. Well, 11 of the kids did not have birth certificates. 11 of them. And so my mother managed on her lunch hours. My mother managed on her lunch hour to make forgeries, to make false copies. She took our birth certificates, made copies of them, did cut and paste. Then she created birth certificates for all of my other 11 brothers and sisters who did not have birth certificates, so they could all get in different schools. They all had different. They went to school with different last names. So my 2 brothers and I were the only ones who were named Allred out of the siblings my age.
And again, you didn't refer to your dad as
but
Rulon.
No, we didn't. But even though legally I was legally his son, but they called when we went into hiding in 1955 to 1958, we all called him Uncle Jim. Uncle Jim, yeah. All called him Uncle Jim. That created a problem though, and then later that my Aunt Ruth became pregnant and. The kids talked about, and my mom's pregnant. Yeah, Uncle Jim came to see her. That was the only thing about it. My dad didn't think it was very funny.
They knew he was their dad, right?
Oh, absolutely.
They called him Uncle Jim as a cover.
No, yeah, in private.
So what does it do? What does it do to sort of have this systematic lying?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
What does that do?
You are such a good interviewer. You know right where I'm going. And so here's this dichotomy. Lance talks about it in his TED Talk. You're taught not to lie, but you can't tell people who your dad is. So you have to lie to protect daddy. And so then there are good lies and bad lies. And then pretty soon, who determines what the bad lies are and what the good lies are? The house. Of course, right away. That was not a pleasant experience.
This is Idaho, right?
Idaho, Pocatello, Idaho.
Okay.
And so church was wherever our family was. And so my dad had very few followers at this time. There was a total, I think, at this time, of about 15 men who followed my father and thought he held all the keys. Because the vast majority of them went with the Colorado City group. A lot of that had to do with the fact that they controlled all the money. It's amazing how having all the money gives you validity.
Follow the money.
Follow the money. Follow the money. And my dad had no money. And then my dad went into hiding for 4 years. He was literally in hiding. And the FBI was looking for him, and the police were looking for him. He was constantly having to move around. And there were, twice when our family had to move in the middle of the night because the police were getting ready to arrest us. Not my mother. My mother had the luxury of being, quote unquote, the legal wife, but almost all the others had to move around from time to time because they were getting under investigation. And so constantly we would get together in our rooms. And in my entire childhood, I was 5 years old the first time I met any of my cousins. I had 47 brothers and sisters. It's not like I was deprived of child contact, but the first time I met my cousins, I was 4 years old. And then a year and a half later, I went to school. I met other kids for the first time. And so my world was so very, very small. But we would have Sunday school in our room. And so always where I was, no matter where I was living, there were always three of my mothers there. And so all of the children of three mothers would get together, and we'd have these wonderful lessons. And then my older sisters would take us off back in the bedroom for the 7 and 8 year olds and the 9 to 10 year olds, and they had the church manuals. They got the LDS church manuals for Sunday school and primary, and they would use those to teach us. And I will tell you, the Allred family did a better job of communicating and teaching their kids than anybody in Mormonism. I guarantee you that. I have a funny story. Years later, at Skyline High School, I was
Skyline
High School. I went to high school here, and I was the only polygamist kid. And the Mormons were not nice to me. They were very unkind.
They knew.
Oh, absolutely. But they recruited me to be the captain of their seminary bowl team because I knew Mormonism better than anybody in that school.
Nice. So did you use the hymn book, the LDS hymn book?
Oh, yeah.
You sang the hymns?
Oh, yeah.
Were there any hymns that you didn't sing because they weren't?
No, but there were a few hymns that had been made politically correct that we had to go back to in our pen and scratch them out.
Which ones? Do you remember?
For example, yeah. Praise to the Man, Joseph Smith. Praise to the Man, and community, so forth and so on. It says,
Long will his blood, which was shed
by assassins. Second verse. Now it's been changed. Long,
Stain, Illinois.
Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins. Now it says, plead unto heaven.
Right, but it was Stain,
Illinois.
So you went back to the Illinois.
Absolute converts, people that had left the church. There was oftentimes young couples. Another thing also is that my dad's children were growing up, and my dad encouraged the older siblings to join the church. But then they joined the
LDS church.
Yeah, the LDS mainline church. But then they went away, and they didn't come back. So then my dad started saying, no more of that. And so he encouraged the rest of us to stay in the group. He didn't want us to go to the church. And those that left and went to the church, he kept trying to get to come back. And some of them he succeeded in bringing back. I have some real tragic stories from that. But then these people started coming around and investigating our group. And I realize now, as an adult, looking back on all of them, they all fit into one of those three categories. I could tell you the story of every single one of them. And if the wife was in favor of it, she usually had brought her husband. It wasn't the wife who was being brought by the husband. It was the wife who was bringing the husband. Because she had met somebody like my mother and my father's wives. I'm not saying they converted him, but they sent such a good example. The women would say, man, I've never seen anything like this. And they would want the same thing.
There are benefits, right? Other people to watch your kids.
Yeah.
Like if you're not maybe wanting to be with the man all the time, you get a little break. Right? Like, and what are other benefits from a woman's point of view?
Well, there's several things. First of all, women are allowed to go out, and the women certainly had far more independence.
They can work.
They can work. They can get a career. They can buy their own car. They can do all these kinds of things. They can, I remember it got to the point, my dad came over to see my mother every fifth day. I could look at a calendar for the next 2 years and tell you which day my dad would be in my house. He had this schedule. And that's what my mother wanted. And that's what that novel wanted. And, but it got to the point my mother would often say, the morning my dad was there, Rulon, I love having you here, but you always put me behind in my schedule. You know what I'm saying? And because then they started to have their own lives beside him. But Aunt Ethelene, when Dad came, everything stopped. Everything stopped when Dad showed up. She didn't care what was going on. It might make sense. But my mother stayed on the schedule. But the respect those women had for each other, and my dad's sisters, some of my dad's sisters were phenomenal. I mean, same caliber of women. My Aunt Beth, for example, was married to Lima Jessup. I loved and honored. I still do Lima Jessup. Very honorable man, very sweet man, but not well educated. Beth was not, quote unquote, well educated. She only had a high school diploma, but she could take anybody on with a master's or PhD in history or literature or anything. Brilliant, brilliant woman. And she raised her kids to be that way. And so had these really remarkable women. And there were not a few. And like,
not a bunch of dummies.
No, not